A little after 6:15 p.m., they both left the house without mentioning it to anyone. Just before 6:30, CCTV in a car park outside a sports centre captured the girls walking together, and it is thought that the direction they were going in was to one of the shops to buy some sweets. They then walked along a path which led to Soham Village College.
Disappearance is incredibly out of character.
At 6:33, they were spotted in the neighbouring streets of College Road and College Close. At 8 p.m, the families, thinking the girls were upstairs, realised they were actually not in the house, and after a search of the area, Holly and Jessica were reported missing just before 10 p.m.
In the quiet English town of Soham, summer evenings once felt peaceful, predictable, safe. Children rode their bikes through narrow streets, neighbours chatted across garden fences, and the slow rhythm of rural life rarely changed. But on one warm August evening in 2002, that calm would be shattered by a disappearance so chilling, it would grip an entire nation. Two best friends, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, were just 10 years old, bright, inseparable, and excited about the last days of their summer holiday. That night, they stepped out of their homes for what seemed like a harmless walk after a neighbourhood barbecue. They laughed together, chatting as they walked through the familiar streets of their small town. But they would never return. At first, their families assumed the girls had simply lost track of time. Perhaps they had stopped to visit a friend, perhaps they had wandered a little farther than planned. Yet as the minutes stretched into hours, a creeping fear began to grow. Something was terribly wrong. Soon, the quiet town of Soham transformed into the centre of one of the largest missing child searches the United Kingdom had ever seen. Police officers, volunteers, helicopters, and search dogs flooded the surrounding fields and forests. Posters with the smiling faces of Holly and Jessica appeared in shop windows, on lampposts, and across television screens nationwide. The entire country watched and waited. Every lead mattered, every sighting was investigated, and in those early days one man seemed to stand out as a helpful voice in the search. His name was Ian Huntley. Huntley was the caretaker at Soham Village College, a familiar face in the community. He spoke calmly with reporters and told police he believed he might have been the last person to see the girls alive. According to him, Holly and Jessica had walked past his house on the night they vanished while he was outside washing his dog. He described the moment in detail. To many watching, he seemed cooperative, even sympathetic. But investigators were beginning to notice something unsettling. The story kept changing. Meanwhile, the search intensified. Days passed with no sign of the girls. Fields were combed, ditches were searched, forest paths were examined inch by inch. Volunteers walked for miles under the summer sun, refusing to give up hope that the two friends might still be alive. But deep down, the fear everyone tried to ignore was slowly becoming impossible to escape. Then, nearly 2 weeks after the girls vanished, the case took a devastating turn. In a remote wooded area near Thetford Forest, not far from RAF Lakenheath, 3 people walking along a quiet track made a horrifying discovery. 2 bodies lay hidden among the trees. Within hours, the investigation changed forever. Police quickly moved to arrest Ian Huntley, and alongside him, they arrested someone else, his girlfriend Maxine Carr, a teaching assistant who worked at the same school the girls attended. The news sent shockwaves through Soham. The man who had stood before cameras, the man who had spoken about helping the search, the man who claimed to have seen the girls alive, was now the prime suspect in their murder. And the woman who had comforted the community and posed with Holly's school card during public appeals had allegedly lied to police to protect him. What investigators would soon uncover was a story far darker than anyone in Soham could have imagined. A story of manipulation, deception, and betrayal hiding in plain sight. Because sometimes the most terrifying truth is not that evil exists. It's that it can live quietly among us, smiling, waving, and pretending to help her, while hiding something unspeakable just beneath the surface. And in the case that would become known as the Soham murders, a peaceful town would soon learn that the danger they feared had been closer than anyone ever realized. Much closer. In the days before everything changed, life in Soham moved at a slow, comforting pace. It was the kind of town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. Streets were quiet, neighbors recognized each other's cars, and children could still walk or ride their bikes without their parents constantly worrying about danger lurking nearby. Families had lived there for generations. Trust was woven into the community like threads in a familiar blanket. For children growing up in Soham, summer meant freedom. And for two best friends, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, that summer of 2002 had been filled with the simple joys of childhood. They were inseparable. Teachers described them as bright and cheerful. Friends said they were always together, sharing secrets, laughing about small things, and talking excitedly about school, music, and the future. Wherever one of them went, the other was usually just a few steps behind. Their families often joked that they were like sisters. The evening of August 4th began like many others during that warm English summer. Earlier that day, the girls had attended a family barbecue in their neighborhood. There were burgers sizzling on grills, adults chatting in small groups, and children running through gardens and along sidewalks. It was the kind of gathering that felt ordinary, safe. As the evening wore on, Holly and Jessica decided to take a short walk. They wanted to buy some sweets from a nearby shop and maybe stroll around before heading back home. It was a simple plan, the kind of small adventure that children in a quiet town often made without a second thought. At around 6:30 that evening, the two girls stepped out together. Holly was wearing a red Manchester United football shirt, something she loved and wore proudly. Jessica walked beside her, chatting as they made their way down the familiar streets. They were smiling. Witnesses would later remember seeing them walking together, relaxed and happy, completely unaware that their lives were about to intersect with something dark. For the next few hours, no one realized anything was wrong. But by late evening, a strange silence began to settle in. Holly's parents expected her back home before it got too late. Jessica's family assumed the girls were still together somewhere nearby. Yet as the clock ticked closer to nightfall, neither girl had returned. At first, their families believed it was nothing serious. Perhaps they had stopped to visit a friend. Maybe they had taken a longer walk than planned. But when phone calls were made to friends, houses, and no one had seen them, concern quickly turned into fear. By the time darkness fell across Soham, the girls were officially missing. Police were notified, and officers quickly began searching the streets and nearby areas. What started as a routine missing person report rapidly escalated into something much bigger. Within hours, the entire town was involved. Neighbors grabbed flashlights and walked through parks, fields, and alleyways. Volunteers knocked on doors asking if anyone had seen the two girls. Local businesses closed early as people joined the search. But there was no sign of Holly or Jessica. As the hours passed, investigators began building a timeline of the girls' final movements. One of the most important witnesses to come forward was a man who lived close to where the girls were last seen. His name was Ian Huntley. Huntley was well known in the town. He worked as the caretaker at Soham Village College, a large secondary school located near the centre of town. Because of his job, he was often seen around the school grounds and nearby areas. Parents, students, and teachers all recognized him. To most people, he appeared ordinary, quiet, unremarkable. When police first spoke with Huntley, he told them something that immediately caught their attention. He believed he had seen the girls on the night they disappeared. According to him, he had been outside his house washing his dog when Holly and Jessica walked past. He said they seemed normal, just two girls heading somewhere together. It didn't seem unusual at the time. But after the girls were reported missing, Huntley realized that he might have been one of the last people to see them alive. Investigators carefully noted his statement. At that stage, every piece of information mattered. While police questioned witnesses, the search operation continued to expand. By the next morning, the case had become national news. Television crews arrived in Soham. Reporters stood along the streets delivering live updates. Newspapers printed photos of Holly and Jessica, showing their bright smiles and hopeful eyes. Their faces appeared everywhere. Across the United Kingdom, People watched the story unfold with growing concern. Hundreds of volunteers joined police officers to search the surrounding countryside. Fields were combed in long lines of people walking shoulder to shoulder. Helicopters circled overhead scanning forests and farmland. Search dogs followed trails along roads and footpaths. Every possible lead was investigated. Meanwhile, the families of the two girls waited in agonizing uncertainty. For Holly's parents and Jessica's parents, time seemed to slow to a crawl. Each passing hour without news made the situation feel more unbearable. They spoke to reporters, pleading with anyone who might know something to come forward. "Please help us bring them home." Their voices carried a mixture of hope and fear. Back in Soham, something remarkable began to happen. The community came together in ways few had ever seen before. Volunteers organized search groups, local churches held prayer services, shops placed donation boxes on their counters to support the families. At St. Andrew's Church, flowers and handwritten messages began to appear outside the building. People stopped there quietly, reading the notes left by strangers. "Come home safely. We're praying for you. We haven't given up." The town was united by a single hope, that somehow somewhere the two girls were still alive. But as the days passed, investigators began to face a troubling reality. There were no confirmed sightings, no clear evidence pointing to where the girls had gone, and no sign that they had simply wandered away. Instead, detectives began considering a possibility no one wanted to imagine: that Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman had been taken. Behind the scenes, police were quietly examining every person connected to the case. They revisited witnesses. They reviewed timelines. And they paid close attention to the statements given by those who had seen the girls on the evening they disappeared. Among those statements, one continued to stand out: the account from Ian Huntley. At first, his cooperation appeared helpful. He spoke openly with investigators and even talked with reporters covering the story. In interviews, he described how shocked he was by the girls' disappearance. He expressed sympathy for the families. He said the entire situation had deeply affected him. For viewers watching the news, he seemed like just another concerned member of the community. But detectives were starting to notice something unsettling: small inconsistencies in his story, details that didn't quite line up. The timeline he described didn't fully match what investigators were learning from other witnesses. At first, these differences seemed minor, but as the investigation continued, those small discrepancies began to grow. Meanwhile, another person close to Huntley was also involved in the public appeals. His girlfriend, Maxine Carr, worked as a teaching assistant at the same school Holly and Jessica attended. She appeared in photographs during the search efforts. In one image, she held a small card Holly had given her on the last day of the school term. Standing among volunteers, she spoke about how much everyone wanted the girls to be found. To the outside world, it looked like a community united in grief and determination. But investigators were beginning to wonder whether something far more disturbing was hidden beneath the surface. As the second week of the search approached, tension spread across the entire country. People followed every update, every rumor, every possible sighting. The story had become impossible to ignore. And then, nearly 2 weeks after Holly and Jessica vanished, a discovery would change everything. In a wooded area near Thetford Forest, close to RAF Lakenheath, 3 people walking along a quiet track stumbled upon something hidden among the trees. Something that would soon send shockwaves across the nation. Within hours, police would move swiftly. Arrests would be made. And the investigation would take a turn no one in Soham was prepared for. Because the man who had calmly told police he might have been the last to see the girls alive was about to become the centre of one of Britain's most horrifying criminal cases. The discovery came quietly, almost by accident. On a calm afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after the disappearance of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, 3 people were walking along a wooded path near Thetford Forest. The area was remote and peaceful, Tall fir trees stretched into the sky, their branches casting shadows across narrow dirt tracks. The ground was uneven and thick with leaves and pine needles. It was a place where hikers often wandered, enjoying the quiet of the countryside. But on that day, the silence of the forest held something terrible. The walkers noticed something unusual near the edge of a track, not far from RAF Lakenheath. What they saw made them stop. Hidden among the trees were two small bodies. Within minutes, the police were called. Officers quickly sealed off the area, blocking the nearby roads and preventing anyone from entering the forest path. Even before the identities were confirmed, investigators already feared the worst. The location of the discovery was only about 10 miles from Soham, the small town that had been searching desperately for the missing girls. As news of the discovery spread through police headquarters, detectives moved quickly. Because by that point, they already had someone in their sights. His name was Ian Huntley. For days, Huntley had been part of the investigation. He had spoken to police multiple times. He had spoken to reporters. He had stood in front of cameras, describing how he believed he might have been the last person to see Holly and Jessica alive. But behind the scenes, investigators had begun to question his version of events. His story contained inconsistencies. Details changed. Timelines didn't always match what other witnesses reported. At first, the differences seemed small, but detectives knew something important about criminal investigations. When someone is telling the truth, their story usually remains consistent. When someone is lying, the cracks eventually begin to show. By the second week of the investigation, those cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. Police began quietly watching Huntley more closely. They examined his movements on the night the girls disappeared. They checked his phone records. They spoke again with neighbors. And they started to wonder if the man who appeared so cooperative might actually be hiding something far darker. Meanwhile, the search operation continued publicly. Television cameras still filled the streets of Soham. Reporters delivered constant updates to millions of viewers across the United Kingdom. The case had become one of the biggest missing person investigations the country had ever seen. People everywhere hoped the girls would be found alive. But inside the investigation team, hope was beginning to fade. Then the bodies were discovered. And suddenly everything changed. Within hours of the discovery in Thetford Forest, police made their move. In the early hours of the morning, officers arrived at the home shared by Ian Huntley and his girlfriend, Maxine Carr. Carr worked as a teaching assistant at Soham Village College, the same school where Huntley was employed as a caretaker. The school itself had already become a central location in the investigation. During the search for the girls, the college grounds had been used as a base for media briefings. Reporters gathered there daily, delivering updates while the community waited anxiously for news. Just meters away from those cameras stood the small cottage where Huntley and Carr lived. At around 4 a.m., police knocked on the door. Moments later, both Huntley and Carr were arrested. News of the arrests spread quickly through Soham. For many residents, the announcement was impossible to believe. Ian Huntley, the same man who had calmly spoken to reporters, the man who had described seeing the girls walking past his house. It seemed unthinkable. But detectives already suspected something even more disturbing. They believed Huntley had not only seen the girls, they believed he had lured them. After the arrests, police began an intensive search of the couple's home and workplace. The grounds of Soham Village College were sealed off with police tape. Officers guarded every entrance. Forensic teams moved slowly through the buildings, examining classrooms, hallways, storage rooms, and maintenance areas. The college was larger and more complex than many people realized. Former students described it as almost maze-like. There were hidden corners, small storage spaces, basements, and maintenance rooms scattered throughout the buildings. Some even spoke about trapdoors beneath the stage in the school hall, and old boiler rooms rarely visited by staff. For investigators, the location presented both an opportunity and a challenge. If something had happened there, evidence could be hidden almost anywhere. Search teams used powerful lights to examine every surface. Specially trained dogs moved through corridors sniffing for traces of human scent. Forensic experts carefully collected items they believed could be important. During the search, police announced they had already recovered objects of major interest to the investigation. Though they refused to reveal exactly what had been found, the discovery intensified public speculation. Back in Soham, the mood had changed dramatically. When the search first began, residents had gathered with hope. Now the town was drowning in shock. People gathered outside their homes whispering about the arrests. Some stood silently on street corners, trying to process the news. Others simply cried. Many walked slowly towards St. Andrew's Church, where flowers and handwritten messages had continued to pile up since the girls disappeared. The small memorial had grown into a sea of colour. Teddy bears, photographs, candles, notes written by strangers. Some messages were simple. "We love you, Holly and Jessica." Others were heartbreaking. "We hoped you would come home." Inside the church, prayers were being held for the girls and their families. Ministers spoke quietly about grief, compassion, and the strength of community. But outside, many people struggled with another emotion: anger. Because the more details that emerged, the more the situation felt like a betrayal. Ian Huntley had not been an outsider. He had lived among them, worked in their school, walked the same streets. Some parents even realized that he had been around their children countless times. The thought was unbearable. And then there was Maxine Carr. During the search for the missing girls, Carr had publicly joined the appeals. She appeared in photographs holding a card Holly had given her at school. She had spoken with sympathy about the girls. Now investigators believed she had been lying to police to protect Huntley. Detectives soon revealed that Carr had provided an alibi for him. An alibi they believed was false. She had told police that Huntley had been at home with her on the night the girls disappeared. But as investigators dug deeper, they began to uncover evidence suggesting that story simply wasn't true. And if Carr had lied, it meant something chilling. She knew what had happened. Back inside the police station, Huntley was being questioned. Hour after hour, detectives pressed him about the timeline of that night. They asked about the girls. They asked about his movements. They asked about the inconsistencies in his earlier statements. At first he denied any involvement. But the evidence was beginning to mount. Forensic findings, witness statements, and now the discovery of 2 bodies in a remote forest. Outside the station, reporters waited for updates. Across the country, millions watched as the case unfolded. The story that had once been about a desperate search was now turning into something else entirely. A murder investigation. And as detectives continued to examine the evidence, one terrifying realization began to take shape. The man who had calmly told the world he might have been the last to see Holly and Jessica alive had been telling the truth, but not in the way anyone expected. Because if investigators were right, he hadn't simply seen them that night. He had taken them. And what detectives were about to uncover would reveal a crime so shocking, it would forever change how the country viewed trust, safety, and the darkness that can hide behind an ordinary face. By the time the arrests were announced, the quiet town of Soham had already been living under a cloud of fear and uncertainty for nearly 2 weeks. Now that fear was being replaced with something even heavier: reality. Inside police interview rooms, detectives continued questioning Ian Huntley about the night Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman disappeared. At first, Huntley remained calm. He repeated the same explanation he had given before. He claimed he had simply seen the girls walking past his house while he was outside washing his dog. According to him, that brief moment was the last time he had any contact with them. But detectives already knew the story wasn't holding together. Investigators had spent days examining evidence, reconstructing timelines, and speaking with witnesses. And slowly, piece by piece, a far more disturbing picture was beginning to emerge. The questions from detectives grew more direct. They pressed Huntley about the exact time he saw the girls. They asked why certain details in his statements had changed. They confronted him with contradictions. Hours passed. The calm expression he had shown to reporters during television interviews began to fade. Meanwhile, outside the station, the country waited. Television channels ran constant updates. Newspapers printed extra editions. People across Britain followed the case almost minute by minute. Everyone wanted answers. But inside Soham, the emotional weight was unbearable. Residents walked through the streets quietly, many still struggling to accept what had happened. Parents looked at their own children differently now. Something that once felt impossible had suddenly become real. Because the man now sitting in a police interrogation room was not a stranger. He had worked in the school. He had lived among them. And he had looked directly into the cameras during the search, appearing sympathetic and concerned. For many people, that betrayal felt as painful as the crime itself. At Soham Village College, where Huntley had worked as the caretaker, forensic teams were still combing through the buildings. The search was slow and methodical. Officers examined classrooms, hallways, storage areas, maintenance rooms, and every corner of the campus. They used powerful lights and forensic tools to detect even the smallest traces of evidence. Search dogs moved through corridors and across the grounds. Every item collected was carefully logged and sent for examination. Detectives already suspected that something terrible had happened close to the place where Huntley worked. And they were determined to prove it. At the same time, investigators were also examining the actions of Huntley's girlfriend, Maxine Carr. Carr had worked as a teaching assistant at the same school. During the search for the missing girls, she had appeared to be part of the grieving community. She joined public appeals. She spoke to people about how much everyone wanted Holly and Jessica to be found. But investigators now believed she had done something deeply troubling. They believed she had lied to protect Huntley. During questioning, Carr had told police that Huntley had been with her on the evening the girls disappeared. If that had been true, it would have given him an alibi. But detectives quickly began uncovering evidence that suggested otherwise. Phone records, witness accounts, timelines that didn't match. Everything pointed to one conclusion. The alibi Carr had given was false. And if she had lied to investigators, it meant she had knowingly tried to shield Huntley from suspicion. That revelation shocked the nation almost as much as the crime itself. Because Carr had stood in front of cameras during the search. She had held up a small card Holly had given her at school. She had appeared to share the community's heartbreak. Yet behind the scenes, detectives believed she was hiding the truth. As investigators continued their work, forensic evidence began to strengthen the case. Items recovered from Huntley's home and workplace were examined in laboratories. Clothing, fibers, other traces that could connect him to the girls. Each discovery added another piece to the puzzle. Meanwhile, the area where the bodies had been discovered remained sealed off. The wooded track in Thetford Forest had become an active crime scene. Police teams spent days searching the surrounding area. Forensic specialists documented every detail. The location itself raised difficult questions. Why had the bodies been taken there? How had they been transporting? And when exactly had they been placed in the forest? The site lay close to RAF Lakenheath, surrounded by farmland and quiet roads. It was secluded enough that someone familiar with the countryside could reach it without drawing attention. Investigators believed the person responsible had carefully chosen the location. Back in Soham, the emotional impact continued to deepen. Outside St Andrew's Church, the growing memorial had become a powerful symbol of the community's grief. Flowers covered the stone walls. Children's toys sat beside candles and handwritten messages. Some people visited quietly, leaving a note before walking away. Others stayed for long moments, staring at the photographs of the two smiling girls. For many residents, the hardest part was remembering how hopeful everyone had been during the search. For nearly 2 weeks, people had believed there was still a chance. A chance the girls had simply run away. A chance they had gotten lost. A chance they would suddenly reappear. Now those hopes had been replaced with the unbearable truth. The girls were gone, and the person responsible had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. As detectives continued building their case, they began reconstructing what they believed had happened on the evening of August 4th. According to investigators, Holly and Jessica had been walking through Soham as planned. Somewhere along their route, they encountered Ian Huntley. The exact details of that encounter would become the focus of intense investigation. But detectives believed Huntley had managed to lure the girls into a situation where they were vulnerable. What happened next was something the community would struggle to understand for years. Because the crime that followed was not only brutal, it was senseless. The lives of 2 children had been taken without reason. 2 families had been shattered, and an entire town had been forced to confront a nightmare that had been hiding just beneath the surface of everyday life. As the investigation moved forward, prosecutors prepared to bring the case to court. The evidence was mounting. The timeline was becoming clearer, and the man who had once stood calmly in front of television cameras was now facing the full weight of a murder investigation. But even as the legal process began, the questions lingering in the minds of many people remained painfully simple. How could someone who appeared so ordinary commit such a horrifying crime? How had the warning signs been missed? And how had the man who killed 2 innocent girls managed to stand among the searchers, speaking with reporters, while the entire country desperately looked for answers? Those questions would soon echo far beyond the town of Soham, because the case known as the Soham murders would not only expose a terrible crime, it would force an entire nation to confront a chilling truth. Sometimes the most dangerous people are not the ones who hide in the shadows. Sometimes they are the ones who stand in the light, pretending to help,